Hey everyone, I noticed a lot of you who are watching and enjoying the content aren't subscribed yet. If you love spine-chilling stories, creepy encounters, and unexplained mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the next terrifying upload. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more of the content you love. I didn't think much about it at the time, but now, looking back, I still can't shake the feeling that something was seriously off that night. It was supposed to be just another blind date. You know the kind, set up by a friend. You meet, grab dinner, maybe laugh at a few awkward silences and go your separate ways. It seemed simple enough. I wasn't expecting sparks or anything, just a casual meal with someone I didn't know. The restaurant was this cozy little place on the corner of a quiet street, dim lighting, soft jazz music playing in the background, and an old-school vibe. Honestly, it felt like a nice spot for a first date. Nothing too flashy, just comfortable. I showed up a little early, hoping to get a feel for the place before he arrived. The hostess led me to my table and told me that my date had already arrived. I don't know why, but I assumed he must have gotten there before me. Maybe he was eager, or maybe he just lived nearby. Either way, when she said he was already seated, I figured I wouldn't have to wait long. When I walked up to the table, I saw him sitting there. He wasn't exactly the kind of guy I'd imagined from the pictures, but it wasn't like he was completely unrecognizable either. He had this blank expression on his face, kind of like he wasn't really there, you know? It was hard to describe at the time, but there was something about the way he just stared straight ahead, not acknowledging me at all. He didn't say hello, he didn't smile or stand up, nothing. I felt the awkwardness creep in, but I still didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just shy, or maybe he was trying to come across as mysterious. But whatever it was unsettling. His smile, when it did appear, wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel at ease. It was like it was forced, but it lingered for too long, stretching a bit too wide for comfort. I sat down across from him, trying to play it cool. Maybe I was overthinking things, right? But that moment, the way he didn't acknowledge me, the way he just stared, felt wrong. The waitress came over a few minutes later to take our drink orders, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The guy hadn't said a word. He just kept smiling in that weird, creepy way. I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to make small talk. I talked about the weather, asked about his job, tried to bring up some easy conversation starters. But every time I looked at him, his eyes were fixed on me, not blinking, not moving. And his smile, it never faltered. It stayed there, wide and strange. And then it happened. The waitress came back with our drinks and she gave the table a quick glance. She didn't say anything at first, but then she asked, "Is everything all right over here?" She looked back and forth between the two of us, her eyes lingering on him for a moment. That's when I noticed it. She looked at him in this way that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't like she was just checking in. She seemed confused, almost like she didn't recognize him. When I glanced back at him, he was still sitting there, motionless. The weird smile was still on his face. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was this tension in the air that I couldn't explain. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe I was being paranoid. But just then something strange happened. As the waitress turned to walk away, I blinked for a second, just long enough for him to disappear. I swear to God, 1 second he was there, sitting across from me, and the next, nothing. The chair was empty, no sign of him, not even the sound of his footsteps, nothing. I froze. I looked around the restaurant, my heart pounding. It wasn't like he just left the table and walked out. No, it was like he'd vanished, completely gone. The waitress came back a moment later, probably thinking I was still waiting for my drink, but when she saw the table, her face went pale. She stared at the empty seat, then at me. She seemed so confused. Did he leave? She asked, glancing around the room as if expecting to find him somewhere else. I stood up quickly, my legs shaking. I don't know, he was just here. Her eyes narrowed, almost like she was piecing something together. She looked down at the table, and that's when she said the one thing I'll never forget. "That's strange," she said slowly. "He's been dead for years." I don't know how I didn't fall over in shock right then and there. My mind couldn't even process what she was saying. The man who had been sitting across from me, the man who had never spoken a word, had died in that very restaurant, years ago. Apparently he used to come there all the time, and when he passed away, he had been such a regular that they left a spot open for him. His haunting spot, they called it. She went on to explain how some of the regulars still claimed to see him every now and then, sitting at that same table. Some said he would even interact with the other patrons, though he never spoke a word. It was like his spirit was still hanging around, attached to that spot. I felt my blood run cold. I had sat down in his spot without knowing it, and I had no idea what I had just experienced. I had sat across from a ghost. The eerie part was how normal everything felt, how normal he felt, how I hadn't even questioned it when I first walked in and saw him. I didn't stay much longer after that. The waitress gave me some strange look as I gathered my things, but I couldn't stay. I had to get out. My head was spinning. The idea of having dinner with a ghost was something I couldn't even wrap my mind around. I've never gone back to that restaurant, and every time I drive by, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I don't know if I'll ever really understand what happened that night, but I do know one thing for sure. Sometimes there are things we're better off. I should have trusted my gut that night. I really should have. I didn't know it then, but everything about this blind date was about to go way off the rails in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. It started with my friend James setting me up with this girl named Amanda. He was always trying to play matchmaker, and honestly, I'd never had much luck with dates. So when he said she was perfect for me, I figured why not? I mean, sure, he had a bit of a track record of being wrong about these things, but how bad could it be? Amanda offered to pick me up, which seemed fine at the time. Normally, I'd meet someone at the restaurant or whatever, but she insisted, and I didn't think much of it. Plus, she seemed super chill on text, nothing weird at all. Just a couple of short messages back and forth about meeting up, some light banter. Nothing made me think twice. When she pulled up to my house, I was already standing outside. Her car was a beat-up old sedan, nothing fancy. I noticed a few bumper stickers and a cracked windshield, but again, no big deal. I slid into the passenger seat, giving her a polite smile as I buckled my seatbelt. At first, everything seemed normal. She smiled and waved, and we chatted for a bit. She was pretty, maybe not exactly what I expected from the pictures James had shown me, but still cute enough. I figured this was going to be one of those fun, easygoing dates. Then, as I looked around the interior of her car, something strange caught my eye. The locks on the doors were all busted, like completely broken. I mean, I could see that they'd been tampered with. There was no way the locks had just broken on their own. They were clearly jammed, and the buttons had been ripped out of the door panels. I couldn't help but notice it, especially because the way she was driving made me feel off. She was taking back roads that didn't seem to go anywhere, like she was intentionally avoiding the main streets. I tried to brush it off as nothing. Maybe she had car trouble or something. But then, she said something that stuck with me even after the night got crazier. She mentioned, almost casually, that no one really knows where we are. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just trying to be funny. But then I started thinking, why would she say that? And why did it feel like we were getting farther away from civilization? I started looking out the window, trying to figure out where we were, but everything was just trees and old houses. No street signs, no lights. It was pitch black, and the further we drove, the more I realized I had no idea where we were. I was starting to feel a little uneasy, but I didn't want to make a scene or come off like I was overreacting. It was just a drive, right? And then she pulled the car over. We were completely alone. No houses around, no lights, no other cars, just the sound of the engine idling and the heavy silence that hung between us. It was so quiet that my heartbeat felt too loud. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something's wrong but you can't put your finger on it. Amanda turned to me and with a weird smirk on her face said, "This is it. This is where we're going to hang out." The way she said it made me uneasy. It was like she was trying to be casual, but it just didn't feel right. I remember feeling a bit lightheaded. A part of me wanted to say something, to ask her what the hell was going on, but another part of me just wanted to get out of the car and leave, like now. And then it hit me. I couldn't. The locks on the door were completely busted. I realized that, at that exact moment, I couldn't open the damn door. I pulled on the handle, tried the button again, but it was useless. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just taking me somewhere random. She had deliberately isolated me. I glanced at her. She was looking at me like she was waiting for something. She kept smiling, but there was something about it that made my stomach turn. She wasn't even blinking. I don't know how to explain it, but her face seemed too still. My mind started racing. Why had I been so stupid? Why hadn't I noticed sooner? This wasn't a casual date. This was something else entirely. She wasn't just weird or quirky. She was dangerous. I felt this sudden wave of panic hit me, and I knew I had to get out. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there. Without thinking, I pulled on the door again, this time harder. I didn't know if the door would open, but I had to try. It clicked. It wasn't fully open, but the door popped enough for me to slip my body out. I jumped out of the car so fast that I almost lost my footing, but I didn't care. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care where I was going. I just ran as fast as I could, through the dark, through whatever this twisted part of town was. I heard her car start, but I didn't stop. I just kept running, weaving through trees and bushes, too scared to even think. Somehow, I found my way to a main road, and eventually, a car pulled over to help. The driver was confused, but I didn't care. I just needed out of there. I ended up at a gas station, still out of breath and shaken up. I called a cab, took it straight home, and locked every door behind me. But that wasn't the end of it, not by a long shot. The next day, I tried to reach out to James. I told him about what happened, hoping he could make sense of it. But all he said was, "I don't know who she is." "What do you mean you don't know who she is? You set me up with her." He just kept repeating, "I don't know who she is," like he had no clue who Amanda was. I asked if he was messing with me, but he looked dead serious, like he was scared. And that was the last time I spoke to James about it. I never heard from Amanda again. I didn't want to know who she was or why she did what she did. I was just happy to be safe, but part of me is still haunted by the thought of her. That smile, the way she looked at me. Sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out of that car. I still remember the date as if it happened yesterday. I mean, you hear a lot of horror stories about blind dates, but I didn't expect to be living one myself. I don't even know where to start, but I guess I should just say it. This guy was weird. It started off fine, like most blind dates do. A mutual friend set me up with a guy named Ben. He was cute enough in his profile pictures, and he seemed all right through the texts. We met at a cafe downtown. Nothing fancy, but it was the kind of place with cozy lighting, soft music, and a relaxed vibe. I figured it'd be a nice chill setting to get to know each other a little better. At first, everything seemed normal. We sat down, ordered coffee, talked about what we did for work, and shared a few laughs. Honestly, I wasn't expecting sparks to fly, but it felt comfortable enough. I'm one of those people who tends to give others the benefit of the doubt, even if something feels off. Maybe it's because I hate the awkwardness of leaving mid-date, you know? I'd much rather just sit through it and see what happens. But man, I really wish I had trusted my gut that day. We were about halfway through the meal when he suddenly excused himself. He said he needed to take a call outside. I thought nothing of it. Maybe he had some important business or something. People get busy, right? So, I stayed at the table, scrolling through my phone, just waiting for him to come back. Time passed, a little longer than I expected, but I didn't think much of it. When he finally came back, I thought, all right, that's done. Now we can get back to the date. But nope. He didn't sit back down across from me like he was supposed to. Instead, he handed me his phone, his face a little too serious. He just said, "I want you to hear something." I remember looking at him trying to figure out if he was joking. I mean, I was still trying to piece together what had happened while he was gone, but nothing prepared me for what was about to happen next. I took his phone, confused, and looked down at the screen. I thought it was maybe a funny video or something silly, but no, it was a voice memo, and he didn't give me much context. He just stared at me, watching me like he was waiting for me to press play. I hit the play button, and the first thing I heard was my own name. His voice, low and slow, dragged out every syllable. "Caitlin," he said. "Caitlin." At first, I thought it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe it was just some odd, unfunny prank, but then he repeated it, over and over. "Caitlin." In that same creepy tone, a weird pause between each one, almost like he was savoring my name, and then it got worse. As if that wasn't enough, there was this strange, unsettling laugh that followed, like a soft chuckle, but it was so hollow and unnatural. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my heart rate picking up, my skin crawling, and for a second, I thought I might actually be imagining. Maybe I wasn't hearing what I thought I was hearing. But I was. It was real. My blood ran cold. I don't know what came over me in that moment, but I felt this rush of panic hit me hard. My mind went blank, and all I could think was get out. Get out of that cafe, away from him as fast as I could. I didn't even say anything. I just stood up, shoved the phone back at him, and bolted for the door. I didn't even care if I was being rude. My gut was screaming at me to leave. I'm sure he didn't understand what was happening. I didn't even stop to look at him as I walked out the door. I just wanted to get away from him. I didn't look back. But when I got outside, I was so shaken I could barely think straight. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a weird joke. Maybe he was socially awkward. I mean, some people have strange ways of doing things, right? But deep down, I knew something was off. I didn't want to be anywhere near him anymore. As I walked down the street, trying to calm my nerves, my phone buzzed in my hand. I didn't want to check it. I already knew it was going to be him, Ben, probably texting me to apologize or wonder where I went. But I didn't expect it to be as bad as it was. Text after text popped up. He was blowing up my phone with messages, one after another, asking why I left so soon. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My heart was still racing, my hands shaking. He just kept sending messages, each one more persistent than the last. I could feel my anxiety building as I read them, each one more unsettling than the last. Where are you? Did I do something wrong? Please don't leave like this. I just wanted to talk. Caitlin, why are you ignoring me? I kept walking, trying to get as far away from him as possible. I deleted the texts, hoping it would help me shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in my chest. But I couldn't forget. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again, his strange, serious expression when he handed me his phone, the way he just watched me as I listened to that weird voice memo. I didn't respond to any of his messages, and honestly, I didn't want to. I didn't want to get involved with a guy who thought it was okay to record himself saying my name in that creepy tone, let alone send it to me like it was normal. To this day, I still don't know what that was about. I never heard from him again after that night, and I sure as hell wasn't going to reach out to him. But the weird thing is, I keep thinking back to those voice memos. Why did he think that was okay? Was he trying to mess with me, or was there something more sinister going on? I was already feeling uneasy before I even knocked on his door. It was one of those blind dates set up by a friend, where you're not sure if you're going to have an amazing night or if you're going to wish you'd stayed in bed. His name was Jake, and from our texting he seemed nice enough, funny, easygoing, even a little charming. He suggested dinner at his place, and I figured, why not? Maybe it would be more relaxed than meeting at a restaurant. When I arrived, the house was bigger than I expected, kind of a shabby two-story, but it looked homey. He answered the door, gave me a warm smile, and led me inside. He was decent looking, maybe not exactly like the guy in his photos, but still, he seemed all right. He offered me a drink and told me to make myself comfortable while he finished up cooking. At that point, everything seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't think much of it when he disappeared into the kitchen. I decided to take a seat on the couch and looked around the room. It was a little messy, but nothing too crazy. Pizza boxes on the coffee table, some scattered clothes in the corner. Typical bachelor stuff. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt quiet, too quiet, like it was missing something, or maybe it was just me being nervous. I told myself to relax, but I couldn't help it. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around expecting it to be Jake, but it was a guy I hadn't seen before. He was tall, with dark hair, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a while. He smiled at me, but there was something off about it. It wasn't a warm, welcoming smile like Jake's had been. It was almost forced. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at me. I was about to ask if he was Jake's roommate or something when he suddenly leaned in close and whispered, "You need to leave." I froze. I wasn't sure if I'd heard him right, and I just stared at him for a moment, too stunned to speak. He looked me dead in the eye and repeated it, his voice low and urgent this time. "You need to leave. He's done this before, and it never ends well." I had no idea what he meant. My heart was racing, and I felt this surge of adrenaline hit me. I didn't know whether to laugh it off or get up and run out of the house. My brain was scrambling for answers, but nothing made sense. The guy just stood there, waiting for my reaction, his face tense and serious. I don't even remember standing up, but somehow I found myself heading for the door. I had no idea what was going on, but something about the whole situation felt off, and I knew I had to leave. I glanced back at the guy, who gave me a quick nod, and then I was out the door. I didn't even think about looking back. I got into my car, slammed the door, and started the engine before my mind could catch up to what had just happened. Was it some kind of prank? Was Jake in on it? Why would his roommate warn me like that? But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt way too real. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't seem to calm down. I drove home as fast as I could, the entire time trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When I got home, I immediately locked the door and sat down on my couch. I needed a drink, maybe something to settle my nerves. But I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. Who was that guy? And what did he mean by "he's done this before"? I pulled out my phone and tried to distract myself with some social media, but the words kept echoing in my mind. Then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jake. "Hey, sorry about that. I know this might seem weird, but I didn't want you to leave. Please don't think I'm some kind of weirdo. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a moment, my stomach dropping. It was like everything I had just felt, everything that had felt wrong, was crashing down on me. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I just stared at the screen. Was this really happening? Was this the same guy who'd been so friendly at first, the one I'd been texting with? The messages started coming in faster now. Where did you go? I really thought we were getting along. Why did you just leave? Then another one. Come on, don't ignore me. This is messed up. My hand shook as I held my phone. The messages were coming in one after another, faster and more desperate. There was no sign of the guy who'd been so laid back and funny just a few hours ago. Instead, there was someone I didn't recognize. The messages became more and more intense. I know you saw what he said. Don't listen to him. I'll explain. I just don't want you to leave me. I felt a sick feeling in my stomach. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. The urgency, the desperation, the way he was suddenly turning everything around on me, making me feel like I was the one doing something wrong, it all felt manipulative. I didn't reply, but the messages kept coming, over and over. Some were apologetic, others were angry, and a few even included emojis. It was like he couldn't decide what he wanted me to think, but I didn't care. I couldn't respond, not after what had happened. I turned off my phone and shoved it in my bag, trying to forget about it for the night. But I couldn't. The thought of him, of what his roommate had said, kept me up. The next morning, I checked my phone again. The messages had stopped, for now, but I couldn't forget the feeling of something being wrong. I didn't feel safe anymore, and that was the worst part of it all. I never met Jake again, and I didn't want to know what he'd been up to before, but I'll never forget his roommate's warning. Something about that night felt like it could have ended in a way I didn't want to imagine. I went on a blind date that still gives me chills. It started like any other, right? I met this girl named Lisa through a dating app. She seemed super normal in her pictures, just your average kind of cute girl who was into hiking, cooking, and dogs. We exchanged some messages, and everything felt fine. After a few days of chatting, she asked if I wanted to come over to her house for dinner. She said she liked cooking and thought it'd be fun to keep things low-key. I thought, why not, and agreed. I'm not gonna lie. At first, everything seemed pretty chill. She lived in a nice house on the outskirts of town, a little further out than I was used to, but it was all good. The kind of quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever really happens. When I got there, she greeted me at the door with a warm smile, looking even better in person. The place was cozy, decorated in that sort of trendy boho style everyone seems to like now. Honestly, it was the perfect setting for a laid-back evening. We sat down for dinner, just the two of us. The food was amazing, and the conversation flowed easily. We talked about all the usual stuff, family, hobbies, work, nothing too out of the ordinary. But after about an hour of hanging out, I started to notice something weird. I was sitting in the living room while she was finishing up some dessert in the kitchen, and I heard faint noises coming from the basement. It wasn't loud enough to be anything alarming, but it was definitely there, like soft thumping, maybe even a muffled voice or two. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking it was just the house settling, but the longer I sat there, the more it bugged me. I wasn't going to ask her about it immediately, but I couldn't help myself. Curiosity got the best of me, so I casually stood up and wandered around the house. I was hoping maybe I could get a better sense of where the noise was coming from, and maybe even figure out if I was just being paranoid. The house was pretty big, and the layout was open, so it was easy to move from room to room without her noticing. When I got closer to the basement door, the noises were louder. It wasn't like someone was screaming or anything, but it was definitely something. I swear I could hear what sounded like whispering, soft, almost unintelligible words. But there was no way to know for sure. I took a deep breath and walked back toward the kitchen, trying not to look too obvious. When Lisa came back into the room with the dessert, I tried to act casual, like I hadn't been snooping around or anything. But I don't know, something about the way she was acting made me uneasy. She was too calm, almost too perfect. And that smile? It wasn't the smile of someone who had just been cooking and hanging out. It was like she knew something I didn't. I decided to ask her about the noise, even though part of me already regretted it. I wasn't trying to be rude, but I figured it was better to just bring it up than to let it hang in the air, right? She stopped dead in her tracks. The look on her face shifted slightly, but she quickly recovered. She looked me straight in the eye, that same calm smile still plastered on her face. "Oh, don't worry about that," she said. "That's not for you to worry about." And just like that, I felt this weird, cold feeling spread through me. It wasn't a huge red flag, but something about the way she said it made me feel like I was in the wrong place. Her tone was too casual for what I was starting to realize wasn't a normal situation. The atmosphere in the house suddenly felt heavy, like the walls were closing in. I told myself I was overthinking things, but the thought of that sound and her strange response kept gnawing at me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to leave. I didn't know what was going on, but my gut was screaming at me to get out of there before it got worse. I excused myself from the table, pretending to feel sick or something, and grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair. Lisa didn't stop me. She just smiled, like she had anticipated my exit. Feel better, she said in that same unsettlingly calm voice. I didn't look back. I practically ran out the door and into my car. I drove home, my heart pounding the whole way. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something bad, but at the time, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The next few days were a blur. I didn't think much about Lisa after that night. I figured it was just a weird date, and I wasn't going to dwell on it. But then, out of nowhere, I started seeing news reports. Police were investigating a case involving missing persons in the area, and it didn't take long for the name of Lisa Street to pop up. Apparently, her house had been involved in some kind of police investigation, but the details were sketchy. They hadn't released much information at that point, but it definitely caught my attention. And then, a few days later, I found out the truth. The noises I heard, they weren't just random. The police had discovered that Lisa had been involved in something far more sinister. Several missing persons cases had been linked to her home, and the basement, yeah, that's where it all happened. It turned out she had been keeping people down there, hiding them away from the world. I couldn't believe it at first. I mean, how could something like that happen so close to where I lived? But as the details came out, everything started to make sense. Lisa had been using her charm to lure people in, just like she had done with me. And for all I knew, I could have been next. I wasn't the first date she'd ever had over, and I sure as hell wouldn't be the last. The whole thing made me sick. I couldn't stop thinking about the weird noises, the way she had acted when I asked about the basement, and that smile. I'd managed to get out before things took a darker turn, but it still haunts me to this day. I never found out what exactly was going on in that basement, but I can't shake the feeling that it was a lot worse than I even imagined. Now, whenever I hear about missing persons cases, I can't help but think of Lisa. And every time I see a new story about someone going missing, I always wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were lured into some unsuspecting house just like mine. I still don't know what I was thinking agreeing to this blind date in the first place. I mean, I was just trying to meet someone new, right? Maybe I got too comfortable with online dating or something, but this was next level weird. It started off pretty standard. I matched with this guy named Mark on a dating app, and he seemed like a decent guy at first. We texted back and forth a couple of times, and he seemed pretty normal. Nothing strange, no red flags, just casual stuff. He suggested a dinner at a local Italian restaurant I hadn't been to before. He was polite, and we chatted about things like hobbies, work, and life in general. The usual first date stuff. The restaurant was nice, small, cozy, not too busy. I walked in, and there he was, sitting at a table near the window. He smiled when he saw me, and I gave him a wave. Honestly, nothing about the night screamed danger or creepy. We sat down, ordered food, and started talking about everything from movies to travel. It was easy, fun. Honestly, I was enjoying myself. Mark was kind of quirky, but in a good way. He had these funny little mannerisms that made me laugh. Then came the moment that would change everything. After we'd finished our main course, Mark suddenly pulled out this paper from his bag. It wasn't like a napkin or something casual. It was a full-on official-looking contract, the kind you'd expect from a lawyer's office or something. He slid it across the table toward me, looking all serious, and asked me to sign it. I laughed, thinking he was joking. What is this, a joke contract? But then he didn't laugh. He just sat there, staring at me. It was like his whole demeanor shifted in an instant. I still remember how his smile disappeared, replaced with a kind of calm seriousness. It's not a joke. I need you to sign this if you're serious about dating me, he said, not breaking eye contact. I thought he was playing some weird game, maybe testing me or being dramatic for some reason, but when I looked down at the contract, it was bizarre. It wasn't anything like a normal relationship agreement, no. It was a full-on list of rules. He had clauses about how often we'd communicate, what kind of activities we'd do together, and the expectations he had about how the relationship would unfold. There were even penalties listed if certain clauses weren't followed. And I'm not talking about anything small. I mean like literal consequences. I couldn't help it. I laughed. I thought it had to be some kind of weird icebreaker or a quirky move. Maybe he was trying to stand out, but then his expression darkened. I'm serious, he said again, this time more firmly. He leaned forward, his voice low, almost too calm. If you don't sign it, there will be consequences. I froze. For a second, I didn't know how to respond. I figured this had to be a prank or something, but the look in his eyes wasn't playful. It was intense. And suddenly, my gut told me this wasn't just some weird way to break the ice. This guy was absolutely serious. My first instinct was to bolt, right there, get up and leave. But the restaurant was full, and I didn't want to make a scene. I'd been on enough bad dates to know how to handle awkward situations, so I figured I'd just play it cool, maybe brush it off and make up an excuse to leave. So I picked up the contract, pretending to read it, but mostly just trying to figure out what to do. That's when he said something else that made my stomach drop. If you sign it, we can move forward. If you don't, well, I can't promise things will go the way you expect. It's not a threat. It's just how things are. I set the paper back down slowly, pretending to still be amused, but inside I was already panicking. What the hell was this? Why was this guy acting so serious about this weird document? It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. Who does this on a first date? I tried to keep my cool and just dismissed it like it was no big deal, but I could feel the tension building between us. He was waiting for me to make a decision, to sign it, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way I was signing this contract, but I couldn't just walk out either. I didn't want to cause a scene. But then, something weird happened. The waitress came by to check on us, and Mark snapped back into his usual self. He smiled, acted all charming again, like the conversation we'd just had never happened. He didn't bring up the contract again. He just casually continued chatting as if nothing was off. I was so thrown off by what had just happened that I could barely pay attention to the rest of the dinner. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about the contract and how serious he had been. I didn't know if he was messing with me or if he was just that messed up in the head. Either way, I couldn't trust him anymore. When dessert came, I barely touched it. I was too busy thinking about how I could get out of there. I didn't know if I should just make a polite excuse and leave, or if I should call someone for help, but I didn't want to escalate it either. He seemed normal again, but there was still that tension lingering in the air. Eventually, I made my excuses. I told him I had to get home early, and he didn't seem to mind. He even paid the bill, which felt like an attempt to be polite after everything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this guy wasn't right. I walked out of the restaurant, but as I was getting in my car, Mark stood by his own car, watching me. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me for a long moment. It was almost like he was waiting for me to say something or do something. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away as quickly as I could, not looking back. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the contract. Was it some kind of game? Was he trying to manipulate me or worse? I don't know. But I do know one thing. I've never gone on another blind date again. A week later, I got a message from Mark. He said he was disappointed that I hadn't signed the contract and that there would be consequences for me not following through. I blocked him immediately, but part of me still wonders what would have happened if I had actually signed it. What kind of guy does that? I don't know, but I never want to find out. I thought blind dates were supposed to be awkward in the usual way. Small talk, trying to figure out if you have anything in common, maybe not feeling a spark. I never imagined something like this. I've been on my fair share of blind dates and I've had some weird ones, but none of them even came close to the one I went on with Brad. We met through a mutual friend who seemed to think we'd be a good match. Brad sounded normal over text. He had a decent job, was into photography, and seemed pretty laid back. So when he suggested meeting at a local bar for drinks, I agreed. Nothing fancy, just a casual spot where we could talk. When I walked into the bar, I saw him right away. Brad wasn't exactly what I expected. He was taller than I thought, and he had this intense look in his eyes. He wasn't smiling, just staring at me as I walked toward him. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about his gaze made me feel like I was being sized up, like I was some kind of object. He stood up to greet me, and we exchanged the usual pleasantries. I immediately noticed he had a camera hanging around his neck. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, he said he was into photography. I figured he'd probably want to talk about his work at some point. We grabbed our drinks, sat down at a small table, and started chatting. At first, it was fine. Normal conversation about work, hobbies, and the usual stuff. But then, as we were talking, Brad suddenly took out his camera and snapped a picture of me. I blinked, unsure of what had just happened. I gave him a confused look, and he just smiled. "I like to capture moments," he said, as if it was no big deal. I chuckled awkwardly, thinking it was just a quirky thing he did. Maybe he was one of those people who documented everything. So, I didn't think much of it. But then, a few minutes later, he took another picture. And then, each time, it was when I wasn't expecting it, when I was taking a sip of my drink, when I was laughing at something he said, or when I was looking around. It felt invasive. I kept trying to brush it off, but the constant flashes of the camera started to make me uncomfortable. I eventually asked him why he kept taking pictures. He looked at me, his expression almost serious, and said, "I'm building a collection. I've been doing this for a while now." A collection? What kind of collection? I was starting to feel uneasy, but I didn't want to make a scene. I laughed, trying to brush it off, but I could feel my stomach twist. This wasn't normal. Who builds a collection of random photos of people? I tried to redirect the conversation, but it felt like Brad was more focused on the pictures than anything else. He didn't even seem to care if I was enjoying myself or not. Every time I looked at him, he was just staring at me through the lens of his camera. By the time our drinks were finished, I was eager to leave. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I didn't feel right. As we stood up to head out, Brad stopped me again. He asked if he could take one more photo of me outside the bar, and I hesitated for a moment before agreeing. I didn't want to seem rude, and maybe I was overthinking things, so I stepped outside, and Brad positioned me in front of the bar's neon sign. It was a nice enough setting, I guess. But when he took the picture, something about his expression felt different. He was almost too focused, like he was zoning in on something. I didn't know if it was just me being paranoid, but I felt like there was something off about the way he was looking at me through the camera. I excused myself after that and said I needed to go. Brad walked me to my car, and I could tell he didn't want the night to end. But I wasn't interested in seeing him again. I was already mentally checking out, feeling the weight of the whole night pressing on me. As I drove home, I kept thinking about the photos. There was something unsettling about them, about the way Brad had been acting. Maybe I was just being sensitive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I figured I'd probably never hear from him again, and that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next day, I got a message from Brad. At first, I thought it was just a friendly follow-up text, but it wasn't. He sent me a picture, one of the ones he'd taken of me at the bar. It was a close-up shot of my face, the one he took when I was laughing at something he said. The caption read, "The next one." I stared at my phone, unsure of what to think. Was this some kind of joke? Maybe he was just being weird? I didn't reply, but then another message came through. And then another. Each one had a different photo attached, some from the bar, some from when we were outside. And each one had a caption that sent a chill through me. The next one. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't just part of some harmless collection. I was part of something else, something that didn't feel right. I blocked him, but even after I blocked him, I couldn't escape it. The photos kept showing up. I didn't know how, but they were still being sent to my email through different accounts with the same caption, "The next one." I started feeling paranoid, like Brad was watching me. I checked my social media constantly to see if he'd found me there, but it didn't end there. A few weeks later, I decided to search the photos online. I don't know why I thought it would help, but I needed to know if there were other people he'd done this to, and that's when I found the website. It was a photo sharing site, but the photos weren't ordinary ones. They were all random shots of people who looked like they didn't even know they were being photographed. And the captions, they all had that same message, "The next one." I never found out who else was in his collection, but I never stopped thinking about it. I deleted everything connected to that night, my account, the photos, and anything that could connect me to him. But the thought of it still haunts me. What kind of person does something like that? What kind of collection was he building? To this day, I wonder if he's still out there, taking photos of people who don't even realize it, adding them to his twisted little collection. I met her on a dating app. Typical story, right? A swipe here, a message there, and before I knew it, we were chatting. At first, it seemed like every other conversation, casual stuff, talking about what we liked, what we did for fun, and the usual, "how's your day going" thing. But there was something about her energy that just felt different. She wasn't like the others I'd talked to. She was really upbeat, always laughing, making jokes. She asked a ton of questions, wanted to know everything about me. It was refreshing, honestly. She was cute, too. Blonde, bright eyes, with this big, friendly smile that made her seem like she could light up any room. After a few days of texting back and forth, we decided to meet up. We agreed on a small cafe downtown. You know, the kind with the comfy chairs, and the vibe that felt like you could stay there for hours without anyone rushing you out. I thought it was a good choice. When I got there, she was already sitting at a table, checking her phone. As soon as she looked up and saw me, her face lit up. The bubbly personality I'd been chatting with online was right there, in person. She stood up to greet me, gave me a hug, and I remember thinking how genuine everything felt. We talked nonstop for what seemed like hours. She was so easy to talk to, and I felt like we clicked right away. I was laughing, she was laughing. It was a good time. The date ended with a promise to meet up again. I was looking forward to it. But the second time we hung out was, well, let's just say it was nothing like the first. We met at a park this time, in the early evening. The weather was perfect, chilly enough to feel fresh, but not so cold you needed a jacket. I got there a little early and sat down on a bench. I checked my phone, scrolled through some stuff, and when I looked up, I saw her walking toward me. This time, though, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't laughing. She was walking, but it was like she was, distracted. Her eyes weren't locked on me. They were kind of glazed, like she wasn't even really looking at anything. I chalked it up to maybe she was tired or had a bad day, but still, it threw me off a bit. She sat down next to me without much of a greeting. The usual energy she had was gone, replaced by this weird distance. I tried making small talk, asking how her day was, but her answers were short. She wasn't her usual self, not even close. I thought maybe she was just having an off day. Maybe she had a lot on her mind. I didn't want to overthink it, but something felt wrong. I kept going, trying to keep the conversation going like I normally would. I mentioned something funny that happened to me at work, hoping it would get a laugh. She barely reacted. No chuckle, not even a smile. Just a nod. I remember thinking, okay, what's going on here? So I decided to just ask, is everything all right? She stared at me for a second, and it was like there was this weird shift. Her eyes got sharper, more intense, like they were looking through me instead of at me. Then she leaned back, crossed her arms, and just stared at the ground. It felt like a switch had flipped, and this wasn't the person I'd been talking to the past few days. I asked her again, are you okay? This time, I could feel my heart rate picking up. Something about her had become unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't talking to the same person anymore. She looked up at me, almost blankly. For a split second, I thought I saw something, maybe a flash of anger, but it was gone just as quickly. Her voice when she spoke was completely different. It wasn't soft or playful. It wasn't warm. It was cold. Maybe you shouldn't have met the real me, she said, and her eyes just bored into mine, like she was daring me to ask more. I felt this weird pit in my stomach. It was like everything in the world had stopped for a second, and all I could hear was the sound of my pulse pounding in my ear. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but she didn't laugh back. She didn't even react. She just sat there. The conversation got awkward after that. I didn't know what to say. I kept trying to ask her what she meant, but she just kept giving me these vague, weird responses. The air around us felt heavy, like something had changed, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I wanted to leave, but I also wanted to understand what the hell was happening. As the minutes ticked by, the more distant she became. She wouldn't look me in the eye anymore, and when she spoke, it was as though she was talking to someone else. I felt like I was sitting next to a completely different person. I tried to push through the awkwardness and suggested we go grab some food, maybe get some air, but she didn't seem to care either way. She barely acknowledged it, just kept looking at the ground. It was like she was miles away, even though we were sitting right next to each other. After a long silence, I stood up. Look, I think I'm just gonna head out. This doesn't feel right. She didn't even stop me. No plea for me to stay, no concern. She just stayed there, staring at the ground, not even looking up as I walked away. I walked to my car, my mind racing. What the hell just happened? The person I'd been talking to, the person I'd thought I'd connected with, wasn't there anymore. I tried to call her a couple of times that night, but she didn't pick up. I even shot her a message asking if everything was okay, but she didn't reply. The next day I got a text from her. All it said was, "Don't contact me again." That was it. No explanation. Nothing. I deleted her number, blocked her on social media, moved on. But I couldn't forget the way she had looked at me that day, like something else was lurking behind her eyes. Something I wasn't meant to see. I still don't know what happened, and I don't know if I ever will. But something about her, something about that day, still chills me. And I'm not sure I'll ever understand why it all turned so wrong.